Hello, students of Bowling Green Christian Academy. This is your teacher, J.D. Mincer, coming to you all via YouTube. We are now going to start our discussion on the major prophets. I'm going to cover the information that you need to know to answer your quiz questions. This shouldn't take very long today. We're going to talk about two of the major prophets. We're going to talk about Isaiah and Jeremiah. But before I do that, and by the way, this is going to be a two-part video series. We're going to talk about Isaiah and Jeremiah, and then we'll talk about the other three major prophets, prophet books, in the next video. So this will take just covering these 5 books of the Old Testament. The idea is to just cover this in 2 videos. So I'll try to make this as concise as I possibly can. Also, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about these prophetical books. This is, of course, the last section of the Old Testament, which means that we are getting to the end of this, guys. It's really exciting. By the way, when we get to the minor prophets, we'll probably talk about like 3 or maybe 4 of those prophets per video. That way we can knock them all out in just a few videos. So, all right, so let's talk a bit about the prophets. So most of the time, when you talk about the prophetical books, the books that are both major and minor prophets, people kind of shrug their shoulders, roll their eyes, kind of skip over this. A lot of people have a tendency to kind of overlook this, and that's unfortunate because there's a lot actually to be gained from studying the Old Testament prophecy books. Most of us don't really know a whole lot about these guys, and that's partially because of their names. A lot of people, when you ask them to name 10, 15, 20, 25 men or women from the Old Testament, a lot of times you aren't going to get mentioned, these guys. And it's just part of the game, part of the way it works. They didn't write feel-good, easy stories for us to follow along. Instead, they read a lot like an uncomfortable conversation. One of the analogies that I heard a long time ago, I'll share with you, and maybe I've shared with you before, is that listening to the Old Testament prophecy books is kind of like living in a house with thin walls, and you can hear the arguments of the people next door. I think I've shared this story before, but my wife and I, when we bought our first house, it was a townhouse, and that means we shared walls with the other tenants. And we were newlyweds, and I remember we would listen. We didn't want to listen, but we'd be sitting in our living room, and we'd overhear the couple next door and the arguments that they'd have. And it was just really awkward and funny to listen to and strange. It just made you cringe. And that's one of the reasons that people don't really get into the prophetical books, is because they read this and it feels a little cringy, a little uncomfortable. Another way you can look at this is that I know we're living in a time period of press conferences, but for a really long time in our history, a press conference usually wasn't the governor or the president coming out. Sometimes they'd come out and speak, but for the most part, what you would see is you would see in a press room, you would see groups of reporters that would gather together, and they wouldn't expect to hear specifically directly from the president. Instead, the president would send out his press secretary, his spokesperson, who would come out. They would read a statement. They would represent what the president has to say or what the authority has to say. And then what they would do is they would give that information, and then sometimes they would take questions. That's a lot of the way you can look at these books as well, is that the prophet's job was not, they're not God. They're giving God's message. Okay? They may be able to answer a few questions. They may be able to give you some insight, but their job is to give you the documented statement of what the authority figure is. And so that's what these are, is when we read these books, we're going to see God's authority here. Now, there's 3 primary things that we're trying to accomplish when we read the prophetical books, and a lot of people mix this up because they think prophets and they think just prophetic, futuristic type of stuff. That's a part of it, but that's actually not the primary goal of the prophetical books. Goal 1 is these guys are preachers. They are here to give us a specific message. And that would be the first answer to the first question, by the way, that I'm going to ask you guys, or one of the questions I'm going to ask you all on the quiz, is that their most important job, their main job, was that these prophets were preachers. Okay. Then secondly, and this is where people rightfully attribute to them, is that their second job was that these prophets were there to predict the future. Some of their predictions were fulfilled right away and soon, even in their lifetimes. And the other ones, it took hundreds, thousands of years, and some of those prophecies haven't even been fulfilled yet. Okay, so it depends on where you're looking at it historically. But yes, part of the job was to give some of that. So the first job, preachers. Second job was to be, of course, prophets, predictors of the future. And the third, and then again, this is where we get a little bit uncomfortable in some of this stuff and reading these. But third, and this shouldn't be overlooked, is that the prophets had a job to warn God's people about the coming judgment. Okay, so they were warners. They had to, at times you'll read things like Jeremiah, and you'll read where they're basically begging these people just to return to God. Now you might think, okay, wasn't that similar to being a preacher? Sort of. The preaching job of this was that they spoke to the people, they spoke to specifically the kings and to slaves alike, and the problems that occurred during those days. Okay, like they spoke directly. It was more like topical. But then when we dealt with like that third area where they were talking about warning them and telling them to return, this is more about an attitude of getting them to fall back into obedience. Okay, like a drill sergeant. Like you've got to fall back into the discipline of following God. Okay, all right. So hopefully you got all three of those basic responsibilities. Now, one of the common questions that I get asked as when I was a youth minister and even as a pastor is like, well, what's the difference between major and minor prophets? Some people build up in their minds some sort of like fantastic, really theological, deep doctrine to try to analyze the answer to this question. The reality of it is that it has nothing to do with that. It's the major prophets are longer books of the Bible. The minor prophets are shorter books of the Bible. So when we look at Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, when we look at their writings, we will see longer books, and that's really the only difference here. So I want to make sure we get that. Lamentations is a little bit shorter. So you might look at Lamentations like, well, that's a shorter book. Why wouldn't that be a minor prophet book? Well, that's because Lamentations is attributed to Jeremiah writing it. And so those two are connected together. So we include that in the major prophetical books. If you don't have one of these, you might want to get your hands on a prophetical timeline. It's not necessarily necessary for quizzes or tests or anything like that, but it's good for us to understand that, okay, so these prophets that we're going to read about, they all take place after two of the primary kings, David and Solomon. And we're going to actually break off into the time period where the kingdom splits off into two. Okay, and you guys remember this from the other Old Testament classes where we talked about there is, of course, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. You've got Israel and you've got Judah. Sorry, I blanked out for a second. Israel is where you're going to see the prophets Amos and Hosea, Jonah to a certain extent. I know that Jonah actually went to Nineveh, to the country of the Assyrians. This is why it's important for us to kind of see which prophets are in which areas and which time periods. So it gives you an idea of what their message is and what it's tying to. And I'll break all that down for you all as much as I can later on. So obviously today we're going to be focusing in on two of these guys, Jeremiah and Isaiah. And Jeremiah and Isaiah are both prophets that are in the southern kingdom, meaning Judah. So their messages are going to have that feel to it, that surrounding, that background to it. So that's something you should probably take note of. Like I said, if you've got one of these timelines that help you break this down, it makes it a little bit easier for us to understand. Now, some prophets that I should probably mention that are not any of the writers of these books are Elijah and Elisha. And they did write these books, but we should probably mention them. They are both located in the northern kingdom of Israel. So I just want to kind of put that out there. That's not necessarily necessary, again, for any of your quizzes, but it's something that's people get confused when they read about 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and they read about those two prophets, and they may not understand the significance of who their audience is. All right, so let's talk about Isaiah first. Isaiah's ministry is going to span for a really long time period. In fact, we're going to see 5 kings that will rule Judah during this time period. It's Uzziah, Uzziah, and you can look that up in your Bibles or online. Jotham, Jotham. Ahaz, Ahaz. Hezekiah, Hezekiah, and Manasseh. And his is spelled Manasseh. Isaiah is the prophet. He is, of course, God's messenger. I like to describe him as the Babe Ruth. If we're going to look at major and minor prophets, I'm always making that goofy joke about, well, the major prophets are the ones who made it to the major leagues, minor prophets made it to the minor leagues. Haha. Very funny, right? If you're going to look at it from that analogy, though, Isaiah is kind of considered the Babe Ruth. The great Bambino of the Old Testament prophets. He's the most well-known. A lot of your modern sermons are going to make references to the things Isaiah wrote, because he wrote a lot of prophecy about Jesus, as we'll look at. But he was God's main spokesperson, and he got the job of giving the messages basically during the good times. So he gets that. There's two major events actually that take place during this time period. First of all, during the kingship of Ahaz, we're going to see the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel. So I guess from that perspective, that wasn't really a great thing. But again, it's not happening to Judah, so what do they care? And during the kingship of Hezekiah, we're going to see the perseverance, how Judah is rescued from the hands of the Assyrians. So again, it's a lot of what Isaiah gets to talk about is good news. It's good stuff. Some other characters in this book that you probably should make mention of, along with Isaiah, is Hezekiah. Hezekiah is the king who I mentioned a minute ago. He is a king who is, for the most part, going to listen to Isaiah and do what Isaiah says. He's not perfect. He doesn't always do that, but for the most part, he follows Isaiah's line of thinking, his instructions. There is a kind of an interesting creature that shows up here in chapter 6 called seraphs. And these were magnificent angels who surround God's throne. And if you read Isaiah 6, 1 through 7, they show up. This might be worth your time to look at that and read it. If you're looking for something interesting to read in this book, that would be a good starting spot. And then there's another character in here that wasn't completely understood about until, of course, years later. And that's this term called the servant of the Lord. This is the title that Isaiah gives to the promised Messiah. So when you see the servant of the Lord show up here, know that Isaiah is making reference to Jesus Christ, who will come later on. All right, make sure I'm getting all this. There is this book, like all the books that we've talked about, we're going to break it up into parts. There are 66 chapters in the book of Isaiah. And the first section is going to take place over half of this. And we're going to call this Isaiah chapters 1 through 35. We're going to call this God's judgment section, God's judgment. And this is where we get a message that's basically aimed at God's own people. And God's telling them that they have strayed away, that they are in spiritual decay. They're not following God's plan. And so you get a lot of just this repetitive message, this difficult message to hear over and over and over again. In fact, if you look at chapters 7 through 12, these are sometimes called the book of Emmanuel, an Old Testament title for God's promised Messiah. So even in this message about how they've strayed and judgment, you do get this glimpse. And this is where Isaiah is a very popular book to read, because even in the difficult messages, you've got this idea about possibilities. And so so we see in this mixed in their chapters, again, I want to make an emphasis of that chapter 7 through 12. We call that the section about God's promised Messiah. And there's a lot of stuff in there about Jesus, so you might want to check that out. Excuse me. All right, the next section is a shorter section. It takes place between chapters 36 through 39. And we're going to just call this the historical interlude. Okay, the historical interlude. These 4 chapters give us Isaiah's perspective on Syrian invasion of Judah that took place in 701 BC. God uses Assyria to turn the hearts of the people of Judah back to him. Okay, so after this long warning, you basically get this continual message, this message that's lasted for 35 chapters from Isaiah, basically saying, look, y'all have strayed from God and you turned from God. So now God is putting this warning into action by saying, okay, the Assyrians are attacking. You've seen the fall of Judah. You've seen the fall of Israel. Now they're coming towards Judah. This is your last chance. And fortunately for Isaiah, Hezekiah and the people repent. They return to God, and so God spares them. And so you get this this brief bit of history where God will show up in a powerful way, and he spares the people. All right, then chapters 40 through 66, we're going to call this the God's Comfort section. God's Comfort. Basically, after he pronounced God's judgment, Isaiah began to tell his people about God's promises of future blessings and restoration. God's judgment has always been a key part of all of the Bible. Okay, and you'll see that here as well. He's not going back on any of that. But he's telling them that even with this coming judgment, there is promise for restoration. There's a plan that's being put in place in order for the people to be saved. And of course, he's going to return to his message about the Messiah. All right, speaking of the Messiah, I know that many of you guys are probably not at the point, now maybe you can during this break, to read all of this book. If you do decide to take a couple of days to study the book of Isaiah, I would recommend checking out chapters 1, chapter 6, chapter 40, and then at the end, towards the end, chapters 52 through 53. And this will give you a lot of the taste of the theme of this book, which of course is about Jesus the Messiah. There are a lot of things in this book. I mean, tons of prophecies about the birth, about the life and birth and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Now keep in mind, all of this was written 700 years before Jesus would even be born. So it's really fantastic that all of this is included in there. You've got, for instance, in chapter 7, verse 14, it talks about how Jesus would be born of a virgin. In chapter 7, it goes on in chapter 53, it talks about Jesus' youth. Talks about how he would be announced by prophets and his message of divinity and just all sorts of stuff, how he would be rejected by his own people. There's lots of verses about that. For instance, chapter 29:10, where he talks about, that's actually quoted later on in Romans 11:8. You've got all of these different types of prophecies that are mentioned and kind of tied into this book. So there's Isaiah in a nutshell. If we had a full class, I'd go into it more in detail, but those are the basics and should help you to answer your quiz questions. Now let's talk a little bit and tackle Jeremiah for just a few minutes. Now Jeremiah is an interesting book of the Bible. Everything good about Isaiah, Jeremiah got kind of the short end of the stick. Isaiah got to give all those fun, happy-go-lucky, good messages. And then Jeremiah is basically the preacher who gets called in after the church has been hit with hard times and difficult times. And Jeremiah now gets to take over afterwards. It's kind of like following in the footsteps of John F. Kennedy or Abraham Lincoln or Ronald Reagan or something like that. You're just going to have a hard time measuring up to those guys. Okay, and so Jeremiah, fantastic book. In fact, it's one of my all-time favorite books of the Bible because there's some great stories here. But Jeremiah is called the weeping prophet for a reason. It's because he has to basically give all of the difficult messages. He's the hospice worker of the Old Testament. I mean, he is the undertaker of the Old Testament. He has to basically talk about Judah and talk to Judah in their dying days. So let's talk about some main characters here. First of all, Jeremiah, of course, he is the spokesperson for God's message to the people in crisis, and his message is really tough. There's another name here, Baruch. It's spelled B-A-R-U-C-H. He is Jeremiah's scribe, his secretary, and he's likely the one who wrote a lot of these words down, if not all of these words down. Okay, so he would have been the guy. Jeremiah, of course, was a prophet, a preacher, a speaker, and so it would have been this guy who would have written that stuff down. And again, his name is spelled B-A-R-U-C-H. And then the last name, the name you're probably familiar with if you've watched any VeggieTale videos, is Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was the Babylonian general/emperor who led the attack against Jerusalem. Okay, he's the one who's going to lead that attack. And ultimately bring Jerusalem, Judah down. All right, let's see here. Some other things you need to know. Keep in mind, nobody wants this job. Jeremiah is the one who's called to do this. God first caused Jeremiah to be a spokesman. King Josiah was on the throne of Judah. The nation of Judah was all that was left of the clans descended from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. At this point, all the northern clans of Israel had been carried away decades earlier and then scattered across the vast Assyrian Empire. So now you've got this new world power, this new threat, and they are the Babylonians. And the Babylonians had basically reduced Judah to a very small, tiny piece of land. So they're nowhere near where they used to be. Josiah was a godly king during this time period. Seems like things were going pretty well during this time period. Again, for instance, if you guys remember in our study of the Old Testament, Josiah was the one who tore down the idols and the pagan worship centers, kind of returned Israel back to being dependent on God again. Unfortunately, this is not going to last for very long. Jeremiah was called by God in the 13th year of Josiah's reign. He swept through Judah under Josiah, or the spiritual revival swept through during that time period. But then that spiritual revival, like a lot of revivals, didn't last very long. And you start to see a disobedience, a return of God's people basically going back to their own wicked ways. So, and that's where we are going to basically pick up here with Jeremiah. So God's judgment came when the armies of Babylon marched through Jerusalem's streets. Okay, I'm going to read a verse here, chapter 1, verse 10. It says, talks about, God even gave Jeremiah a job description. He tells him in this verse, your ministry, God said, will be to uproot, to tear down, to destroy, and to overthrow. Well, think about that for a job description based on what God is telling him. He's like, look, your job is to tear all of this apart. You're going to destroy them. You're going to uproot them. You're going to overthrow them. Basically, you're going to be the most unpopular guy around. Okay? 2/3 of Jeremiah's ministry is going to be a negative message. Think about that. If you had to get up and preach that kind of a sermon every single Sunday morning, hey, guess what? Sermon's going to be a negative one. 2 out of 3 times. It's going to be a negative sermon. And so most of the time, almost all of the time that Jeremiah's given this message, people are going to reject him. They're not going to want to hear this. They're going to turn away. Okay? And so this is going to again, if you're putting yourself in that situation, this is going to give you a picture of why Jeremiah is called the weeping prophets, because he has to give this type of message. Most of the time, people left his presence either under the crushing weight of guilt or raging mad. Okay, so he didn't get to give a lot of those feel-good sermons very often. Let's see here. God wants us to use this book. So you might be thinking, okay, well, that's depressing, Mr. Mincer. Why are you telling us that? Well, God has a purpose for this book, and that's for us to read it and to understand that as we face challenges, to think carefully and consider following God. Okay, so which we can relate to today. Things are not necessarily going the way we want to in the world. And so this might be an appropriate and an important book for us to look back on, to read and to realize and understand why it is that God would have such a message for our own lives. You might want to take a quick look at the Babylonians. The Babylonians during this time period, I think we've discussed how they were a little different than the Assyrians, and you might want to look that up. One of the other themes of Jeremiah's life is that he was pretty much alone in all of this. Jeremiah in public was unbending. He was powerful. He was an extremely powerful voice for God. Give him credit. When you read this book, you see a zeal, a passion for serving and giving God's message. He does this really well, and he faces a lot of scrutiny, a lot of problems, and he's very unpopular. He becomes exactly what he wants him to be, a pillar of iron. But one of the things you're going to see and discover when you read this book is that when Jeremiah gets home, when he returns to his bedroom, when he gets on his own knees, he struggles. I mean, this is difficult on him. You could read this as you're reading this in the book. Jeremiah, when he saw the people of Judah continue to disobey, and that's really what breaks his heart, is that he's given this message. He's given this message of repentance, of hope, of what they can do to fix things, and time again they reject that. Okay, we're not going to worry about breaking down the book itself. It doesn't lend itself really well to breaking down into like 3 parts. Instead, I just want you to just kind of look at this book. It's a really long book. Jeremiah was a priest by birth, a descendant of Moses' brother Aaron, priest serving in the temple of Jerusalem. But then he became a prophet. So keep in mind, this was a priest that God calls to change his career and to become a prophet. Jeremiah's book is a collection of prophecies spoken at different times. Again, this is why this doesn't quite lend itself really well to like here's section 1, here's section 2, here's section 3. It's probably because this is most likely a collection of all of his messages and sermons that have been combined together, which is why it also makes for a really long book. It's the second longest book of the Bible. It's going to be a quiz question. The second longest book of the Bible. Many of y'all probably already, off the top of your head, can tell us what's the first longest book of the Bible. Hint, it's Psalms. Psalms the longest. This is the second longest. Jeremiah was a contemporary of the prophet Habakkuk. Ezekiel prophesied in Babylon during the last years of Jeremiah's ministry in Judah. Jeremiah refers to the prophet Micah by name, so you actually get some other references of prophets in this book. Daniel referred to Jeremiah and used Jeremiah's prophecy to predict that Judah's captivity in Babylon would end after 70 years. So if you read, as we talk about and study Daniel later on, Daniel 9, he's going to make reference to the book of the writings of Jeremiah. And then the Old Testament mentions 8 other men named Jeremiah, which is another reason it's a bit confusing. There's actually 2 men named Jeremiah who show up in this book. In chapters 35 and in 52. You see other references to other men named Jeremiah. It's a common name during that time period. It's a common name in the Old Testament. So if you guys get confused with that, just be sure you're talking about the right Jeremiah. All right, so that's the end of that video. It went a little bit longer than I wanted to, but hopefully that'll help you guys answer all these quiz questions. Our next video will cover the next 3 of the major prophets, including one of our favorites, Daniel. All right, see you guys in the next video.